Welcome to part 14 of the Second World War. Now we're going to talk about African Americans during the war, which I refer to as an American hypocrisy. It is important to note that African Americans played a major role in World War II, and that they had several units that served with great distinction during the war. Probably the most famous of these are the Tuskegee Airmen. Right? The Tuskegee Institute actually switched over to training pilots, right? And these airmen began flying for the United States Army Air Force, right? They flew in North Africa, in Italy, and in the European campaigns, and they flew with great distinction. For example, the 99th Pursuit Squadron earned the Distinguished Unit Citation for its efforts over Sicily during the invasion of that island. The 32nd Fighter Group shot down 3 Messerschmitt Me-262s in a single mission. These pilots are going to do a fantastic job during the war. In fact, when the North American P-51 Mustang went into service during the war, Tuskegee Airmen were some of the first units that got this aircraft. It was the best fighter aircraft that the Americans would develop during the war. And, I mean, let's just be honest. You give your hot rod planes to your hot rod pilots, right? There's a reason why these men got these planes first. African American units also fought with distinction on the ground. Remember, the military at this time is still all segregated, right? And so they're all separated out. But for example, there were African American tank battalions, like the 761st Tank Battalion. The 761st was the spearhead for Patton's Third Army, the original Black Panthers, as they would call themselves, right? They were often the first ones sent into the line of action. They were attached to the 4th Armored Division, all right? Now, they're driving these Sherman tanks, and these Sherman tanks are not designed to go up against Panzers or Tiger tanks, right? They're certainly not suited for taking one on head on. That's why the movie Fury can be so infuriating to watch these guys take on this Tiger tank face to face. So these guys are going to develop a lot of the flanking techniques that are used by other units as well, because they don't want to die, and so they're going to develop tactics that allow the Sherman to work with maximum efficiency against these better armored German tanks. Now, they'll be the first to breach the Siegfried Line. This is the German version of the Maginot Line going into Germany. And there will be the 761st Tank Battalion will be the first group of American forces that are going to link up with the Soviets. They'll meet up with them at the River Styr in Austria, right? Now, the newsreels will depict this different because they'll film it later, but it'll be an African American Tank Battalion that'll be first to link up with the Soviets. During World War II, for every man on the front line, there were 4 men behind the lines. And of course, disproportionately, they were African American units. African Americans were actually very dominant in the motor pools and for running supply lines, unloading ships, things like that. And so they'll be pivotal when there's going to be supply issues after the breakout in France. When Patton's Third Army is rushing through France at breakneck speed, going about 9.4 miles a day, it's going to be African American supply motor pools that are going to keep them in supply. They're actually going to form a series of single one-way highways that they'll call the Red Ball Express, right? These are one-way truck routes. The trucks will go in with supplies towards Patton's Third Army or Hodge's First Army. And if there's no supply depot where they stop, the truck becomes a supply depot. Once that truck's empty, it gets on a one-way road back to the beachheads there at Normandy to refill. These African-American motor pools are going to be pivotal in keeping these armies supplied. And they're also going to be pivotal for rushing the 101st Airborne to Bastogne during the Battle of the Bulge. Right? If you watch the movie Band of Brothers, you'll see they actually get that wrong. It was an African-American motor pool that moved the 101st into the city. So why do I call this a hypocrisy? Well, because while these African American units are fighting with distinction to help free Europe, they are still forced to live with segregation back home. Now, some of this we already talked about, right? Armed forces are segregated, right? But you also have that standard segregation, all those segregation laws that are on the books amongst all kinds of other things. Theaters, drinking fountains like the picture you see here, hospitals even, schools, of course, things like that. And in fact, there's POW camps for German prisoners of war here in the United States, and the German POWs actually have more rights than African Americans. For example, Camp Clinton in Mississippi is going to be the prisoner of war camp where Hans-Jürgen von Arnim, who was the head of the Africa Corps when it surrendered in Tunis, this is where he's going to be held as a prisoner of war. Well, a prisoner of war in Clinton, Mississippi, right, this is just west of Jackson, Mississippi, he is going to have his own personal staff. He's going to have his own driver. He's going to be able to drive into town. He can go to the movie theaters if he wants. He can enter through the normal entrance of a movie theater, where, of course, African Americans would have to enter through the colored-only theater. I think the most telling story on all this, though, is the story of Charles Branford from Wilson, North Carolina. Charles Branford is an African American born and raised in Wilson, North Carolina. He made the decision to enlist. In Wilson, North Carolina, where he grew up, there was a hot dog shop, a place that sold hot dogs. It was called Dick's Hot Dogs. Don't blame me, I didn't name it. Okay. But it catered only to whites. Separate but equal, right? Well, this is the rationale. You can buy hot dogs in other places. Therefore, this is still separate but equal because you have access to hot dogs, right? But you just can't buy them there. So, Charles is getting ready to ship out. And he goes into Dick's Hot Dogs. And he goes to the clerk in the front. And as he's walking in, he notices out of the corner of his eye, there's three guys in jumpsuits eating hot dogs, and there's two guys standing over him, but he doesn't really pay much attention to him. He's not really thinking about that. He's a little bit nervous. He's walking into this place, right? He walks up to the clerk and he says, "Look, I know I'm not supposed to be in here, but I'm shipping out tomorrow. I'm going to go to basic training. I'm going off to war. I don't know when I'm going to be back. I don't know if I'm going to be back. All my life, I've grown up here. I've always just wanted a hot dog from here. And I was just wondering if you could just bend the rules this once and sell me a hot dog, I would deeply appreciate it." Now, the woman behind the counter says, "You know what the hell, why not?" And so she does. She makes him a hot dog with the works. It's got everything on it, right? And she prepares this hot dog. She hands it to Charles Branford. And Charles Branford's about to take a bite out of this hot dog when the managers notice what's going on by this point. Walks out, slaps the hot dog out of Charles Branford's hand and says, you get out of here. You ain't supposed to be in here, right? Charles Branford now he's pretty upset, turns and starts storming out of the place. And when he's walking out, now he notices these guys that were sitting in the corner. The three men in the jumpsuits are actually being watched by two men with armbands on that say MP, military police. And on each of these men's jumpsuits are three stenciled letters, P-O-W. These are German prisoners of war who are sitting in Dick's Hot Dogs in Wilson, North Carolina, eating hot dogs while Charles Branson, born and raised in Wilson, and about to go serve and possibly die for his country, is denied just a simple hot dog from this stand. If that's not an example of an American hypocrisy, I really don't know what else is. Now, there was also discrimination in the workforce, right? Defense programs. There's a whole lot of jobs that are being created here, good paying jobs, right? But African Americans are not seeing very many of them. Well, like, for example, in the aviation industry, despite the efforts of the Tuskegee Institute and stuff like that, only 2% of African Americans worked in the aviation industry, and none of them in skilled positions. They were sweepers and things like that, right? With this dire need of manpower, it seemed to make sense that there should be some kind of benefit for these African Americans that are entering the workforce as well, including the opportunity to work some of these more lucrative jobs. Now, initially, FDR isn't going to really do anything about this. FDR doesn't really take any action in civil rights unless he's kind of pressed into it. It wasn't the foremost on his mind. All right. A. Philip Randolph, however, will push it to the front of his mind. A. Philip Randolph is an organizer. In 1925, he created a labor union called the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters. This is an all African American labor union, right? So he is very good at getting things organized. Now, he tells the story that he was musing one time after church that there's got to be some way to draw attention to the disparity in the workforce to the president's attention. And a woman of his congregation said, you know what, I bet you if we had 50,000 Negroes march on the White House that he would pay attention. And he said, you know, that is a brilliant idea. And he begins to organize a march on Washington. His plan is to get 100,000 African Americans to march on the Mall in Washington, D.C. It draws enough attention while he's planning this march that FDR actually invites him to the White House, and they have a meeting with other leaders of the African American community. And the result of this is going to be Executive Order 8802. This is just a few days after the meeting, right? The Executive Order 8802 is going to desegregate the defense industry. Any of these companies that are that are involved in defense production must allow African Americans opportunities for these jobs as well. The result, of course, is A. Philip Randolph cancels the March on Washington, and African Americans began having opportunities to get these jobs. A. Philip Randolph also learned something else very important that other civil rights leaders are going to use in the future. He says, clearly, in order for a civil rights movement to be effective and successful, it has to have three aspects. First of all, it must be a mass-based movement. You have to have numbers, 100,000 people in Washington, right? It must be nonviolent, right? It must not discredit itself. And it must advocate federal action, not state action. It has to advocate action from the top down. Now, Executive Order 8802 may have desegregated the war industries, but it doesn't mean that it didn't lead to backlash. Now, like I said, there's not a lot of labor strikes during World War II in the United States, but there were race riots. As a matter of fact, in total, there were somewhere around 200 or more race riots across the United States. Any city in the United States that had the potential to become a war industry city had the potentiality for riots. Right? Even in Belmont, Texas, where a shipyard was built, you're going to have a race riot. 2,000 men are going to walk off the job and in search for a African American that a woman claimed who had raped her, and in turn, you're going to end up having 3 African Americans killed in Beaumont. Right? The largest race riot is actually going to take place in Detroit. In Detroit, you're actually going to have a lot of industries there, and when the Packard Motor Company decided to desegregate its assembly lines, you're going to have 20,000 workers walk off the job in June of 1943. Okay, this coupled at the same time with the opening of a new housing development called the Sojourner Truth Development, which was housing for these African Americans that were migrating into Detroit. People were protesting against that, the NIMBY attitude, not in my backyard, right? We can't have the African American community here because they'll devalue my house, right? And so these two things create a recipe for disaster. On June 20th, 1943, a fight will break out on Belle Island that blows up into a citywide riot. By the time the riot's over, about 24 hours later, you got 34 people dead, mostly African American, over 600 injured, and several thousand arrested. Like I said, this is just one example of several riots that will take place during the war. This was the most severe. But any place where you had a war industry, you had the potentiality for riots. But African Americans were not the only groups that were dealing with race issue and strife during the war.